The Secret Mechanic. At 2:41 a.m. on October 16, 1944, in a freezing motor pool outside Metz, France, Private First Class Charles Kelley knelt beside a shattered Sherman transmission and listened, not to the engines, not to the rain beating the tin roof above him, but to the screaming of men burning alive hours earlier. He could still hear it. It hadn't stopped. Not in his head. The wreck was 20 meters away, still smoldering in the mud. A Sherman M4A1 burned to a hollow black shell, its turret frozen at a useless angle. The steel was warped like melted wax. The paint bubbled and peeled. The gun, silent. Inside it, 4 men had died. Not because they were cowards, not because they made a mistake, but because the transmission locked at the worst possible moment, halfway across a field under German fire, turning the tank into an iron coffin. Kelley had been the last person to see them alive. He remembered one of them, Corporal Matthew Reed, 22 years old, freckles, bad handwriting, yelling through the hatch. "We can't move, the gears are locked." Then the Panzer IV shell hit. The sound wasn't an explosion. It was a punch, deep, metallic, final. Now, hours later, Kelley sat in the mud with oil-stained gloves and eyelids heavy from exhaustion that sleep couldn't fix. The transmission casing beside him was cracked open like an autopsy. He knew the manuals. He knew the specifications. He knew what headquarters insisted was acceptable mechanical loss. But staring into the stripped assembly of gears and tension bolts, Kelley whispered through clenched teeth, "This isn't acceptable. It's murder." Shermans were supposed to be the backbone of the U.S. Armored Forces, fast, adaptable, reliable. That's what the posters back home said. But Kelley and every tanker on the European front knew the truth. Shermans burned. Shermans jammed. Shermans died. And the men inside died with them. He pressed his thumb against one of the transmission dogs, a metal tooth worn smooth where it should have bitten cleanly into the gear. The failure was subtle, small, something inspectors back in the U.S. factories probably ignored to meet quotas. To them, it was a tolerable deviation. To Kelley, it was the reason 4 charred helmets now lay lined up under a tarp. He slammed his fist into the steel so hard the pain jolted up his arm. Then he breathed, slow, controlled, dangerous. "HQ won't change it," he muttered. "Patton staff won't slow operations. The factory sure as hell don't care." He tightened a wrench, eyes narrowing. "So, I will." Somewhere outside, an artillery distant boom echoed across the black fields. Someone lit a cigarette. Someone coughed. Someone cried quietly where no one could see. Kelley wiped his hands, leaned over the exposed gearing, and began altering U.S. Army equipment without authorization. Not for glory, not for rebellion, but because men were burning alive in machines built to save them. And Kelley wasn't going to let that happen again. Not while he could still hold a wrench. Not while the screaming was still fresh. Not while the dead had names. By 4:13 a.m., the rain had turned into sleet, thin, sharp crystals that cut the face and clung to metal like frostbite. Kelley didn't notice. His world had shrunk to wrenches, bolts, and the slow grinding rhythm of gears under his hands. Across the motor pool, a sergeant walked past, saw the lantern glow under the tarp, and called out, "Mechanic, get some sleep. We roll at 800. Kelley didn't even look up. "Transmission won't wait." The sergeant paused. The kind tone vanished. "That's an order." Kelley finally lifted his head, slow, deliberate, eyes hollow but burning from something colder than grief and hotter than anger. "Those men in that tank," he pointed toward the blackened wreck, They followed orders too. Silence. The sergeant didn't say another word, didn't argue, didn't repeat himself. He just walked away. Because the look in Kelley's eyes wasn't disobedience. It was purpose, deadly, unwavering purpose. By dawn, the mud beneath him was frozen and his fingers were numb, but the modification was almost complete. A new tension catch, reinforced guides, a tolerance correction that violated 6 separate Army directives. No paperwork, no authorization, no approval. Just a mechanic deciding that the book was wrong and reality was bleeding. He wiped the grease off his hands, stood and stretched, joints cracking from cold and hours of stillness. Footsteps crunched behind him. Someone was there. 3 soldiers, 2 tankers, and a lieutenant watching him. The lieutenant spoke first. "You changed it." Not a question, a statement. "Yes," Kelley replied. "You know modifying Army equipment is punishable?" Kelley finished for him. "Yeah, I know." The lieutenant stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for regret, fear, hesitation. He found none. Just exhaustion and fury. The kind that turns into resolve so strong it can't be moved. Finally, the lieutenant asked, "Will it hold?" Kelley breathed once. "If it doesn't," he said, voice low, steady, "I'll bury the next crew myself." The tank crew behind the officer exchanged looks, not of doubt, but of grim hope. Kelley had become something more than a mechanic in their eyes. He'd become a chance. The lieutenant nodded slowly. "Mount up," he ordered his crew. "We'll field test it." Kelley stepped forward. "No." The men blinked. Kelley pointed at himself. "If someone's dying in that thing, it's gonna be me first." The lieutenant studied him, then stepped aside, wordlessly. Kelley climbed onto the Sherman, boots thudding against steel still scarred with ash from another tank's death hours earlier. He dropped into the commander's hatch, sat with his hands on the metal as if it were alive, and whispered, "Don't you betray them again." Then he ordered, "Driver, engage first gear." The engine roared. The gears engaged. Perfectly. No grind, no hesitation, no stall. Kelley felt something shift inside him, not relief, validation. He keyed the intercom. Second. The tank rolled forward through the muddy yard. Third. Tracks bit into earth and frozen slush. Reverse. Smooth, controlled, alive. When the tank came to a stop, the crew stared at Kelley like they were seeing a ghost. Not someone alive, but someone who had already decided his life was just a bargaining chip for theirs. Kelley climbed out, boots splashing in cold mud, and looked at the lieutenant. "It works," he said quietly. Then, after a pause, almost painfully, "But it's not enough. We need to fix all of them." The lieutenant swallowed. "All? There are 60 Shermans in this division." Kelley wiped his hands on a rag. "No," he said, "there are 60 chances to stop funerals." By noon that same day, the first modified Sherman rolled toward the front line with Kelley sitting on the turret, hands gripping the metal, eyes fixed on the horizon like a man escorting a wounded friend into danger. Behind him, infantry marched through mud and slush. Artillery boomed somewhere beyond the tree line. The sky hung low and colorless, like the world was holding its breath. The lieutenant who rode inside the tank stuck his head from the hatch and called up, "You don't have to sit up there, you know. You're not crew." Kelley didn't look down. "I'm staying until I know it survives." The lieutenant sighed, not annoyed, but because he understood. Some men followed orders. Some men followed ghosts. The road ahead was chewed up by weeks of fighting. Burned-out Panther turrets littered the ditches. Trucks lay overturned, wheels still turning in cold wind. Some wrecks had helmets and bones nearby. No one stopped to bury them anymore. Everyone was too busy trying to avoid joining them. The further the column moved, the closer the sounds of war became. Machine gun bursts, distant screaming, the thudding rhythm of German artillery feeling its way across the valley. And then, without warning, the first shell hit near the front. The shock wave threw mud and snow into the air. Men ducked. Someone shouted for cover. The lieutenant yelled into the internal radio, "Driver, push forward, don't stop." This was the moment Kelley feared. Shermans tended to panic under strain. Engines stuttered, gears protested, tracks hesitated. This one didn't. It lunged forward, hard, almost eager. German machine guns opened up from a farmhouse ahead, tracer rounds stitching across the frozen road. Bullets pinged against armor. Kelley flinched, not from fear, but from memory. He remembered 4 voices screaming. He remembered fists pounding inside a sealed hatch. He remembered being helpless. Not today. The lieutenant shouted, "Target at 11 o'clock, armor piercing." The cannon fired. The farmhouse wall erupted in bricks and splinters. Machine guns fell silent. The battalion kept moving. But Kelley wasn't watching the enemy. He was listening to the tank. Every gear shift, every vibration, every sound that wasn't silence. He leaned down to the open hatch. "How's she holding?" The driver answered, breathless. "Feels different, tighter, like she finally listens." Kelley didn't smile, but something in his face softened. That was enough. For now. When they finally reached the forward position and the tank shut down, the crew climbed out, filthy, exhausted, alive. One of the loaders, barely 19, walked up to Kelley. His voice shook. "You saved us." Kelley stared at him for a long moment, then said quietly, "No, I just fixed what was killing you." That night, back at the motor pool, the lieutenant approached him again, this time with a folder under his arm. "Orders from command," he said, voice low. "Official directive. No unauthorized mechanical alterations to transmissions. Penalty. Court-martial." Kelley didn't react. The officer continued. Unofficially, he opened the folder. Inside were 2 lists. On the first, tank serial numbers, every Sherman in the division. On the second, crew names next to them. The lieutenant handed Kelley a pencil. "Pick which ones you're willing to lose." Kelley stared at the paper. His jaw tightened. His hand shook. Then, slowly, he set the pencil down. "I'm not losing any." The lieutenant nodded once. "Then we work fast, quiet, no paperwork, no witnesses." Kelley whispered, "We?" The lieutenant's answer was barely audible. "You didn't think you were alone, did you?" What began that night wasn't maintenance. It was rebellion. One tank at a time. One bolt at a time. One saved life at a time. And the war was about to notice. The next 3 weeks blurred into one long night. There was no sleep schedule anymore, no shift rotation, no separation between hours, just tools, cold metal, and the growing list of Shermans that passed quietly through Kelley's hands. Sometimes 3 mechanics worked, sometimes 6. Sometimes it was only him, hunched over transmission cases until his back locked and his fingers bled through gloves stiff from grease and frost. No one spoke much. Talking felt like disrespect. Every tank represented men who might burn alive if Kelley failed, and the weight of that wasn't something a joke or story could lighten. Word spread without anyone meaning to spread it. Tank crews began leaving small items beside his workspace: a can of coffee, a new wrench, a pack of cigarettes, even a rosary. Nobody said thank you. They didn't need to. The items were thank you, silent, terrified gratitude. Kelley worked until his muscles trembled and his eyes blurred. Every time he tightened the last bolt on another modified transmission, he whispered the same 3 words, quiet enough that they belonged only to the dead and the machine. Don't fail them. The first test of their work came sooner than anyone expected. A German armor counterattack slammed into U.S. positions near the town of Dornat, panzers rolling through fog, infantry behind them, artillery falling like steel rain. 3 Shermans were sent to block the approach. 2 of them had been modified by Kelley. The third, scheduled for modification the next morning, was still factory standard. The crews knew it. You could see it in their eyes. Fear wasn't the problem. Soldiers lived with fear. Helplessness was the thing that hollowed a man. When the order came, move out, the 3 tanks rolled forward. For 7 seconds, everything was fine. Then the unmodified Sherman stuttered, paused, stalled mid-shift. The driver fought the throttle, the engine screamed, the tank froze in the open, a perfect target. A German 75mm shell struck the hull. Fire burst from the turret seam like a tortured scream of metal and flame. The tank didn't explode. It burned, slow, punishing, alive. The crew inside didn't climb out. They never had the chance. The radio crackled in the other 2 Shermans. Someone whispered, voice shaking, "Not again." But this time, it wasn't again, because both modified tanks didn't slow. They didn't choke. They didn't hesitate. They moved, fast, aggressive, angry. The first tank fired and hit a Panzer's track, locking it in place. The second flanked, something Shermans were never supposed to risk at close distance, and fired point blank into the rear armor. The Panzer burned. Then another. Then infantry broke, and suddenly the impossible happened. Shermans, the tanks that always ran or burned, were winning head-on. Hours later, after the counterattack collapsed and the battlefield quieted into that uneasy silence only war knows, the surviving tankers returned to the motor pool. They didn't cheer. They didn't clap Kelley on the back. They just stood there, helmets off, eyes raw, uniforms burned and blackened, staring at him like he'd performed surgery on fate itself. Finally, the loader from the surviving tank stepped forward. His voice cracked. "They kept moving," he whispered. "Even when we thought they'd freeze." He swallowed hard, breath shaking. "They didn't." Kelley didn't smile. He didn't feel pride. He felt something colder, something heavier, responsibility. As long as the tanks lived, the men lived. And as long as he lived, he would keep those machines breathing. Even if the army wanted him stopped, even if it meant prison, even if it meant death. Because Kelley now knew something terrifyingly simple. War doesn't just kill. War exposes who refuses to watch others die. The morning after the Dornat engagement, Kelley was summoned to battalion headquarters. Not with a request, with military police. 2 MPs walked into the maintenance tent, boots wet with frost, uniforms stiff with starch and authority. One of them unfolded a typed paper without emotion. "Mechanic First Class Charles Daniel Kelley," he read, "you are ordered to appear before the battalion commanding officer immediately." No explanation, no tone, just procedure, cold and sharp as a firing pin. The mechanics froze. Tank crews nearby stopped mid-sentence, mid-movement, mid-breath. Everyone knew what this was. The Army had finally noticed. Kelley wiped his hands on a rag, though grease still bled through his fingerprints like ink on paper, and followed the MPs through winter air that smelled of diesel, snow, and quiet panic. Inside the command tent, heat crackled from a blackened oil stove. Maps covered the walls. Pins and strings traced roads, rivers, and the front line. A line that shifted like a living creature refusing to stay still. Colonel Everett stood at the table. A hard man, a practical man, a man responsible not for machines, but for lives. He didn't offer a chair. He didn't offer a greeting. He simply stared at Kelley with an expression somewhere between disappointment and something heavier, something almost like respect he wished he didn't have to feel. Finally, he spoke. "You altered 6 transmissions without authorization." Kelley didn't apologize. "Yes, sir." You bypassed safety protocols. Yes, sir. You used undocumented machining, non-standard tolerances, and field improvisation. Yes, sir. Colonel Everett leaned forward, voice low. And because of that, yesterday, 2 Shermans moved through fire like nothing this Army has seen, while another, the one we plan to modify next, died in the snow. Silence. Not the comfortable silence of men thinking, the dangerous kind. The kind where a career, or a sentence, or a future is being measured. After a long moment, the colonel exhaled through his nose. "Kelley," he said quietly, "do you know what happens to soldiers who disobey direct technical protocols in wartime?" "Yes, sir." "What?" "Court-martial, dishonorable discharge, prison." The colonel nodded. "Sometimes worse." His eyes narrowed. "Were you trying to be a hero?" Kelley shook his head. "No, sir." "Then why did you do it?" Kelley answered without hesitation. "Because men were dying, not in battle, in machinery." His jaw tightened. "And because nobody else was fixing it." The colonel didn't move for several seconds. Then, slowly, he walked to a small metal locker beside the stove. He unlocked it, pulled out a folder thick with handwritten letters and incident reports. The top page bore a sentence underlined 3 times. Transmission failure resulted in total crew loss. The next page, another, and the next, and the next. He set the stack down with a quiet thud. Then he looked at Kelley, not as a subordinate, but as a witness to something ugly. "These reports," Everett said, "don't leave this tent." He paused. "And neither does what I'm about to tell you." He stepped closer. So close that Kelley could see the exhaustion in the lines of his face, the sleepless war behind his eyes. Then the colonel lowered his voice to a harsh whisper. "Keep modifying them." Kelley blinked, stunned. Everett continued. "But you will do it off record. No paperwork, no requisitions, no official acknowledgement." His voice hardened. "If anyone from higher command asks, your work never happened." Kelley frowned. "Sir, why the secrecy?" The colonel tapped the folder filled with casualty reports. "Because admitting there's a design flaw means halting production. Halting production means fewer tanks, and fewer tanks means losing the war." He stepped back, tone final. "And losing the war is not an option." Before dismissing him, the colonel added one final instruction, the one that would define Kelley's legacy more than the modifications themselves. "Train others. Teach them quietly. Build a network." Kelley nodded, not with pride, not with excitement, but with the grim acceptance of a man who understood that the burden he carried was no longer his alone. As he stepped out into the cold, tankers and mechanics watched him, waiting, expecting handcuffs. Instead, he gave one small nod, a signal, a sentence without words. "We continue." And in that moment, something shifted, not in brass, not in policy, but in the beating heart of the Armored Corps. Because from that day forward, Charles Kelley was no longer just a mechanic. He was the man who changed the fate of machines and the men inside them. The very same night, in a dim maintenance tent illuminated by one dangling red-filtered lantern, Kelley gathered 5 men, the ones he trusted most. They weren't officers. They weren't factory engineers. They were grease under the nails, sleeves rolled up, curse when the wrench slips mechanics. The kind of men who'd been fixing tractors and Harley engines long before the war gave them tanks. There was no speech, no ceremony, just Kelley's voice, low, steady, dangerous. "We're doing this quietly. No journals, no signatures, no record. If someone asks how these tanks improved, we say, we got lucky." The men nodded, not because they fully understood, but because they trusted the man saying it. Kelley pulled back a tarp and revealed a Sherman transmission, but not like any they'd seen before. Gears recut, bearings replaced with scavenged aircraft-grade parts, coolant vents widened by hand-drilled precision. One mechanic, a tall Arkansan named Skipper Evans, whistled. "Jesus, Kelley, this ain't standard issue." "No," Kelley said, "but it works." He gestured to a notebook, thick, battered, edges stained with oil. Not Army-issued, homemade. Hand-drawn schematics, measurements, stress curve sketches, corrections in pencil, ink, and sometimes blood. This wasn't just field work. It was engineering, evolving with every battle report, every broken gear, every transmission that failed under fire. Kelley placed the notebook on the crate between them like a priest setting down scripture. "This," he said quietly, "never exists officially. If I'm captured, this burns. If any of us are questioned, we deny it. Understand?" Evans nodded first, then the others. A silent oath. Not patriotic, not romantic, practical. The kind men take when they know they're betting their future on something that needs to be done. Within 2 weeks, the network spread. One mechanic trained 3. Those 3 trained 9. 9 trained dozens. By late January, across France, Luxembourg, and Belgium, in barns, frozen depots, rail yards, and half-bombed machine shops, mechanics were whispering the same phrase: "Run it the Kelley way." Shermans rolled into battle that winter with transmissions that no manual described, yet tank commanders began noticing patterns. Gear shifts smoother, engines running cooler under strain, less stalling on inclines, fewer breakdowns mid-advance, and most telling of all, crews surviving longer. One night, as Kelley tightened a final bolt on a tank outside Nancy, a tanker approached him quietly. A kid, maybe 19, helmet too big, eyes exhausted. He didn't salute, didn't introduce himself. He just extended a folded paper. Inside was a handwritten message. "My brother was in one of the tanks you fixed. They made it home. Thank you." Kelley didn't know what to do with that. Praise was never his goal. He wiped his hands on his coat and nodded, awkward, almost embarrassed. The kid walked away. Kelley folded the paper and tucked it inside his breast pocket, a pocket already filled with crumpled letters just like it. But word travels fast in war, and not just downward. By early February, someone else had taken interest. Not a mechanic, not a tanker. A procurement officer from Army Material Command, a man who didn't like surprises, especially unauthorized ones. His reports were short, cold, and deadly. Field modification activity detected. Deviation from standardized specifications. Possible breach of command integrity. He wasn't writing to understand. He was writing to shut it down. Rumors spread that Kelley's work was about to draw the wrong kind of attention, the kind backed by courts and handcuffs. Mechanics grew nervous. Some whispered it was time to stop before the hammer fell. But Kelley didn't flinch. He tightened a bolt, wiped his hands, and finally said the words everyone was afraid to say out loud. "They can shut us down later. Right now, men are dying. So we work." And just like that, the fear evaporated, replaced not with confidence, but with purpose. Because now, this wasn't just engineering. It was defiance, a quiet rebellion inside the U.S. Army, fueled not by ego or pride, but by something simpler and heavier: duty to the men trapped inside those steel coffins. By mid-February, snow was melting into mud thick enough to swallow boots and stall jeeps. Supply trucks crawled through France like exhausted animals, leaving deep brown scars in frozen earth. Kelley was elbow-deep in another transmission overhaul when the warning came. Not alarms, not gunfire, just a mechanic jogging toward him, pale, breathless, nervous. "Kelley," he hissed, "he's here." Kelley wiped grease from his hands, not looking up. "Who?" The mechanic swallowed. "Major Harold Beckwith, Ordnance Command." That stopped him. Beckwith was a name whispered like a curse in motor pools. He was the kind of officer who lived by manuals, not results. A man who thought the war should be fought according to printed diagrams and typed forms. The complete opposite of Kelley. And worse, Beckwith wasn't just here to observe. He had authority, the power to shut down operations, confiscate equipment, and drag violators to a court-martial before sunset. Minutes later, Major Beckwith stepped into the maintenance tent. Tall, immaculate uniform, gloves so clean they looked polished. He scanned the room the way a man checks for contamination. Behind him, two clipboard officers scribbled notes like stenographers at a trial. Kelley stood straight, not defensive, not submissive, just steady. Beckwith didn't waste time. "You're Kelley. Mechanic First Class Charles Kelley, sir." Beckwith raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. So you're the one making unauthorized modifications to government property." Not a question, an accusation. Mechanics nearby froze, tools suspended mid-air. Kelley answered evenly. "I've been improving transmission reliability in field conditions, sir." Beckwith removed a folded document from his coat. "Military equipment does not require improvisation. It requires compliance." He tapped the paper with gloved fingers. "And compliance has signatures, testing protocols, review boards, chain of command documentation." A cold smile followed. "You have none." Beckwith walked slowly around the tent, inspecting the reworked transmissions. Gas-cooled bearings, redesigned vent housing, modified idle gear spacing. His voice sharpened. "You're risking catastrophic system failure and potential death of crews." Kelley finally spoke, jaw set. "Sir, the old design was already doing that." Beckwith paused. A dangerous silence settled. Then he stepped closer, so close Kelley could smell his aftershave under diesel fumes. "You are a mechanic," Beckwith said softly, almost condescendingly. "You turn wrenches. You do not redesign Army engineering." Kelley didn't blink. "With respect, sir, I redesign anything that kills my tank crews faster than the enemy does." Something flickered in Beckwith's eyes. Irritation, maybe disbelief. He motioned to his assistants. "Seize the modified transmissions. Tag every Sherman affected. Freeze all field repairs. Starting now, nothing leaves this depot without my clearance." Mechanics stiffened. Tankers overhearing from outside took a step forward, not aggressively, but protectively. This wasn't logistics, this was survival. Beckwith continued. "And until further review, Kelley, you are relieved of all duties." The words hit harder than any shell. Not because they humiliated him, but because they meant time. Time man did not have. Before anyone could react, a deep engine roar echoed from outside. A Sherman, fresh from one of Kelley's unauthorized modifications, rolled into view. The turret hatch popped open, and a tanker climbed out, still wearing soot, still shaken from adrenaline. He saw Beckwith, didn't salute, didn't pause. Instead, he walked right up to the officer and said, "Sir, 5 miles back, there's a Panther dug in behind a railway embankment. We should have been dead. Transmission held under full torque in second gear for 7 straight minutes. If this was the old factory spec, we'd be smoke in the snow." He pointed at Kelley. "That man saved my crew before we even saw the enemy." Beckwith stared at him, then at the tank, then, slowly, at Kelley. For the first time, something shifted in his expression. Doubt. Not acceptance, not respect. Just the first crack. And in war, sometimes, that is enough.
The standoff didn't end with shouting or orders. It ended with engines. Because less than an hour after the confrontation, a runner from HQ stumbled into the depot, Boots soaked, uniforms splattered with mud and panic. "Enemy armor pushing through the forest near the crossroads," he gasped. "Panthers, maybe tigers, 2 companies at least." Every tanker froze. Major Beckwith's officers exchanged worried glances. Shermans could handle Panzer IVs. Panthers? Tigers? That was a different equation. The kind where armor thickness and penetration charts suddenly felt like warnings, not numbers. The runner continued. "Infantry's falling back. Mines didn't stop them. We need tanks now or the flank collapses." Beckwith didn't speak at first. He just stared at the map table as if the lines might rearrange themselves into something less terrifying. Finally, he looked up. "How many combat-ready Shermans do we have here?" A mechanic answered before anyone else could. 3, factory standard. Then, after a beat, and 9, Kelley modified. Beckwith's jaw tightened. This was the moment. Either pride or practicality would command. Everyone waited. Even the engines outside seemed to hold their breath. Then Beckwith spoke. "Start them." Not shouted, not confident, but unmistakable. Permission. The mechanics moved instantly. No hesitation, no paperwork, no signatures, just hands, tools, fuel, and urgency. Engines roared to life one by one. Not the strained coughing of factory-tuned transmissions, but a smoother, hungry growl that sounded different, alive. By the time tank crews mounted up, snow was falling again, thick, heavy flakes that stuck to helmets and melted against engine heat. Kelley climbed onto the lead Sherman, not as a commander, not as a passenger, but as a man who needed to know. A voice behind him called out, "You sure you want to ride along?" Kelley answered calmly, "If I broke these machines, I ought to be the first one to learn it." The loader grinned. "That's one hell of a warranty policy." The tanks rolled out. Not cautiously, but with purpose. A column of steel moving through winter forest where muffled gunfire echoed like distant thunder. As they rounded a tree line, the battle came into view. American infantry pinned behind broken fences and shattered stone walls. German armor advancing, Panthers in staggered formation, guns steady, turrets scanning. One Panther fired. A Sherman ahead of them took the hit. A flash, a scream, then smoke. Not Kelley's modification, a factory spec. A reminder, a warning. War did not forgive hesitation. The tank commander beside Kelley called out, "Load armor piercing." The loader slammed a shell into the breach. The Sherman lurched forward. The modified transmission didn't struggle, didn't slip, didn't hesitate. It responded like an extension of the crew's will. Panther ahead rotated its turret, slow but deliberate. Sherman closed distance, 60 yards, 40, 30. Fire! The 75mm gun thundered. The Panther's glacis plate sparked, but held. The commander cursed, "We need flank." The Sherman accelerated, faster than any factory model had a right to. Tracks churned mud and snow as the tank swung wide, engines screaming but not choking. Kelley braced himself against the hull. Every vibration, every strain, every movement told him one thing. The modifications weren't luck, they worked. The Sherman reached the Panther's weaker side armor. Fire! This time the shell punched through. The German turret lurched, flames bursting from seams. Crew bailed, some burning, some screaming. But the American line behind Kelley's tank erupted in a roar. Not of triumph, but of momentum. The kind that turns chaos into belief. More Shermans pushed forward. One took a hit, survived. Another climbed a slope that normally stalled transmissions. This one didn't. German armor began reversing, not in organized retreat, but in panicked disbelief. The tide didn't turn because the Shermans were stronger. It turned because for the first time, they could move when they needed to. Mobility wasn't advantage, it was survival. And Kelley's machines had given it back to them. When the last Panther retreated into the tree line, men on the ground didn't cheer. They just stood there, breathing hard, snow and steam rising around steel and flesh. Finally, someone said, "We shouldn't have survived that." And another answered, "We shouldn't have, but we did." Kelley exhaled slowly, hands shaking not from fear, but from the weight of realization. For the first time since this secret began, he knew he wasn't just fixing machines. He was changing the battlefield. The battle near the crossroads changed something, not just in the front lines, but in the atmosphere around the mechanics camp. Before, the modified Shermans were a rumor, a whispered advantage, a gamble. After that engagement, they became proof. Word spread faster than supply trucks. Tank commanders told officers. Officers told brigade staff. Brigade staff sent telegrams to Corps headquarters. And Corps headquarters asked one chilling question. Who the hell authorized these modifications? Not in anger, not in confusion, but in a tone that meant, this changes things, and we need to understand how. Within 48 hours, Kelley found himself summoned again. But this time, not alone. Tank crews followed him, mechanics flanked him, even the battalion chaplain walked alongside as if part of a procession. When Kelley entered the command tent, it wasn't empty like the first time. It was crowded. Maps, teletypes, officers from logistics, operations, and armored doctrine. And in the center, General George S. Patton. Silver helmet, stiff posture, presence like a drawn sword. The temperature in the tent seemed to drop. Patton didn't look at paperwork or reports. He looked at Kelley, as if measuring him, confirming him. Then Patton asked one question. Is it true my Sherman tanks are running faster than the Germans expected because of you? Not confrontational, not accusing, curious, but dangerous, like a loaded weapon sitting on a table between them. Kelley answered with the same honesty that nearly got him court-martialed. Sir, they were failing. The gears were stripping under torque load and overheating under sustained climbing. I didn't redesign them for speed. I redesigned them so they'd stop dying under men who trusted them. Patton turned slightly, eyes narrowing. Can every Sherman be modified? Kelley didn't hesitate. Yes, sir, but it takes time and trained hands. How many trained hands? Right now, 12. If you give me men, tools, and time, 100. Patton raised his chin. And how many Shermans can your network alter per week? Kelley considered. If supply lines hold, maybe 20. 20? Not a miracle, but a beginning. Patton studied him for a long, tense moment. Then, without warning, he barked a laugh sharp enough to startle an officer near the telegraph machine. "Mechanic," Patton said, stepping closer. "You bypassed regulation, ignored the chain of command, and altered United States armored production doctrine in the middle of a war." Kelley braced himself. Here it comes. Then Patton put a gloved hand on his shoulder. And thank God you did. Gasps, actual gasps, rippled through the room. Patton continued. The Germans do not stop to fill out forms. The Germans do not wait for permission to improve a machine. The Germans innovate because the battlefield demands it. His tone hardened, not angry, but righteous. We do not beat an enemy like that by being polite. Patton turned to the officers. Effective immediately, all Kelley modifications are to be classified as authorized experimental field upgrades. One major sputtered. But sir, Ordnance Command. Patton cut him off with a glare that could flay a man. Ordnance Command will adjust, Major. The war will not. Silence. Absolute. Then Patton faced Kelley again. You're not relieved of duty, son. He paused. You're promoted. A sergeant stepped forward and handed Kelley a small, worn box. Inside, gleaming despite grease and battlefield grime, were new rank chevrons. Technical sergeant. Not ceremonial, not honorary, earned. Patton leaned in, voice low and serious. From now on, Kelley, you don't just fix tanks. You make sure fewer Americans are buried beside them. After the meeting, as the officers dispersed and radio traffic resumed, a mechanic slapped Kelley's shoulder with a nervous grin. So, what now? Kelley looked toward the line of Shermans outside, engines steaming in the cold, battle scars visible in metal and memory. And he answered, "Now, we get back to work." Because promotions weren't the goal, recognition wasn't the reward. Men were still dying, and until the machines stopped failing them, Kelley wasn't finished.
Spring thaw arrived slowly, dragging mud, smoke, and exhaustion across Europe as the war ground toward its brutal end. Town by town, mile by mile, the Allies pushed deeper into Germany. And wherever Shermans rolled, a quiet pattern emerged. If the tank was factory standard, it survived sometimes. If it had been touched by Kelley's network, it survived more often than anyone expected. Crews began painting a small symbol beside the kill marks and chalk slogans on their hulls. A wrench crossed with a lightning bolt. Informal, unauthorized, but universally understood. A Kelley tank. As the front advanced, Kelley and his expanding crew followed, sometimes working in barns, sometimes in ruins, sometimes outdoors under artillery thunder. Their work never stopped. Even after liberation parades, even after towns cheered, even after news spread, Berlin was falling, the Reich was collapsing, victory was near. One night near the Elbe River, a tanker approached Kelley during a pause in the march. The soldier held his helmet under his arm, hesitating like a man asking for something he wasn't sure he had the right to say. Finally, he asked, "You ever wonder how many men you saved?" Kelley didn't look up from the transmission he was tightening. "No, you should." Kelley paused, just for a moment, then kept working. "I'd rather focus on the next one." The war ended. Celebration was loud, chaotic, emotional, like pressure finally released after years of clenched teeth. Tank crews hugged the machines that had taken them through hell and back. Some kissed steel, others cried with relief, exhaustion, or grief. Kelley didn't stand with the crowd. He walked down the row of battered Shermans, hands brushing chipped armor and welded seams. Every hatch, every scorch mark, every scarred bolt and plate. They weren't just vehicles. They were survivors. When demobilization began, paperwork caught up with the battlefield. Promotions made official, commendations awarded, reports submitted. Somewhere in the bureaucracy, a folder thick as a Bible appeared, labeled Field Improvisation, Undocumented Performance Gains, submitted by T. Sergeant Charles Kelley, unofficial. Engineers studied his notes. Some dismissed them. Others saw the future. The Army never publicly acknowledged Kelley's network. Wartime innovation rarely matched peacetime doctrine, but something undeniable happened. His changes didn't disappear. They evolved. Transmission architecture, gear load distribution, heat dissipation systems. Ideas born in muddy foxholes and ruined farms became baselines for post-war armor doctrine. Not copied, not credited, but absorbed. Like a whisper becoming part of a language. Kelley returned home to Ohio after the war. No parade, no medals pinned in front of crowds. Just a train ride, a duffel bag, and grease permanently stained into the lines of his hands. He worked quietly. First at an auto garage, then at a tractor plant, eventually teaching machining at a small technical college. Students never understood why their instructor inspected tolerances with the intensity of a surgeon. They never knew why he repeated, "Machines don't fail, people fail machines." Nor why sometimes, very rarely, he'd pause mid-lecture, stare at nothing, and whisper, "Just hold together," as if speaking to a tank still climbing a snowy hill under fire. Years later, long after his students had moved on and the world had changed, Kelley received a letter. No return address, just a single sentence inside. We made it home because our transmission didn't quit. Folded with it was a photo. A Sherman tank, crew smiling beside it. On its hull, faded by time but still visible, the symbol. Wrench plus lightning bolt. Kelley held the picture a long time. Not proudly, not mournfully, just quietly. As if finally acknowledging what he had refused to count. He died in 1971, not in uniform, not in a tank yard, but peacefully at home, surrounded by ordinary tools and ordinary life. No headlines marked his passing, no documentaries, no battlefield monuments. Just a name in Army records, tagged beside a phrase few historians ever investigated. Unofficial field modifications demonstrated statistically significant reliability increase. But in the years that followed, when armored units trained, when mechanics learned tolerance standards, when engineers debated load curves, a quiet, stubborn idea remained. If the machine is failing the soldier, change the machine. And long before the world knew engines like those in the M60, the Abrams, and later battle tanks, a simple, unspoken truth lived among tank crews. Sometimes, the difference between living and dying is the mechanic who refused to accept good enough. That was Charles Kelley's legacy. Not medals, not rank, not monuments, just survival, written into steel.